This is HOA anger. It started with a fence line and ended with a board meltdown. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. Today I am going to tell you about the worst 6 months of my life, and how a string line, a stack of photos, and one very stupid mistake by the HOA turned everything around. Let me take you back to the morning it all started. I am standing in my driveway at 6:45 in the morning trying to leave for work, and Heather Jones is blocking my car with her body. She is screaming at me about a contractor truck parked in front of my house. The truck belongs to a fence crew I hired 3 days ago, and they are not even here yet. They are scheduled to arrive at 8. Heather is the Special Assessment Coordinator for the Hidden Creek Association, which is the HOA that runs my neighborhood in Anchorage, Alaska. I moved here 2 years ago because the job market for gym managers is strong, and I got an early morning open shift at a 24-hour fitness center downtown. The pay is good, the hours are predictable, and I thought buying a house in a quiet subdivision would be the smart, stable choice. I was wrong. Hidden Creek is one of those communities where certain homes get special treatment, and everyone knows it. If you are friends with the board, your violations disappear. If you are not, they pile up like snow in January. I am not friends with the board. I keep to myself, I follow the rules, and I thought that would be enough. It is not. Heather is yelling that my contractor violated quiet hours by parking on the street yesterday evening. Quiet hours are 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was 6:30 p.m. She does not care. She is holding a clipboard with a pink violation notice on top, and she is waving it in my face like a weapon. The notice says I owe $250 for unauthorized construction activity during restricted hours. There is no signature, no date, just a handwritten line that says compliance review pending. I tell her the truck was not here during quiet hours. I tell her the crew has not even started work yet. I tell her I submitted my fence permit application to the HOA 3 weeks ago, and I have the email receipt to prove it. She smiles at me, and it is the worst smile I have ever seen. She says, "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." Then she taps the cheap plastic badge clipped to her cardigan and says, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." I do not have time for this. My shift starts in 40 minutes, and if I am late, my boss writes me up. My gym manager license depends on staying out of legal trouble, and the last thing I need is an HOA filing some bogus lien that shows up on a background check. So I take a photo of the notice with my phone. I tell Heather I will deal with it after work, and I back my car out slowly while she stands there glaring at me. That was the first mistake I made. I thought this was a one-time thing. I thought if I stayed calm and followed the process, it would go away. I was wrong. When I get home that night, there is a second notice taped to my front door. This one says the fence project is under review for setback compliance, and I am required to provide proof of survey within 72 hours, or the project will be declared invalid and subject to immediate removal. There is no signature on this one either, just a stamp that says Hidden Creek Association Compliance Department. I do not even know we have a compliance department. I call the HOA office and leave a message. No one calls me back. I email the board president. No response. I email Heather directly and ask what survey she wants and what format. She replies in 8 minutes. The email says, "Submit a licensed survey with current boundary markers and notarized certification, and if the survey shows any encroachment onto HOA easement or neighboring property, the fence must be removed at your expense, and you will be responsible for all assessment fees." She does not say what the assessment fees are. She does not say what the easement is. She just says I have 72 hours. I do not have a survey. The house came with a legal description and a plat map, but I do not have a licensed surveyor report. Getting one costs about $800 and takes 2 weeks. I have 72 hours. I am starting to realize this is not about the fence. This is about making an example of me. I spend the next 2 days calling surveyors and explaining the situation. Most of them laugh when I tell them the timeline. One guy tells me HOAs cannot actually require a new survey unless there is a legal dispute, and if I already have a plat map and my fence is going where the old one was, I am probably fine. He says it sounds like harassment and I should document everything. I thank him and hang up, and then I start documenting. I pull up the HOA covenants and read the fence section for the fourth time. It says fences must be 6 feet or shorter, must match the approved style list, must be set back at least 2 feet from the property line, and must not obstruct sight lines or drainage. My fence is 5.5 feet tall, cedar picket style, set back 2.5 feet, and it replaces a rotted-out fence that was in the exact same spot for 15 years. I am following the rules. I know I am following the rules. But Heather does not care. On the third day, my contractor shows up at 8 a.m. with his crew. His name is Mike, and he has been doing fences in Anchorage for 20 years. He takes one look at the notices taped to my door and says, "This is going to be a problem." I ask him what he means. He says HOAs in Hidden Creek have a reputation, and he has had 3 jobs here in the past 2 years where the board tried to shut him down mid-project by claiming permit issues or surprise easement violations. He says the trick is to get everything in writing and take photos every single day because they will lie about what happened. Mike and his crew start pulling out the old fence panels. The wood is gray and splintered, half the posts are rotted through at the base, and the whole thing leans about 10 degrees toward my neighbor's yard. The neighbor is a guy named Dan, and he has been fine with me the whole time I have lived here. He comes out while the crew is working and says he is glad I am finally replacing the fence because the old one was ugly, and he was worried it would fall over in a windstorm. He says if the HOA gives me trouble, let him know, and he will back me up. I thank him and feel a little bit better. At 10:30, Heather shows up. She is wearing the same black cardigan and black visor she always wears, and she has the plastic badge clipped to the front. She is carrying a stack of pre-filled forms and a digital camera. She walks up to Mike and says, "Stop work immediately. This project is not approved." Mike looks at me. I look at Heather. I say, "I submitted the permit 3 weeks ago." She says, "Your permit was conditionally approved pending survey verification, and since you have not provided the survey, the approval is void." I pull out my phone and show her the email I got from the HOA office 4 weeks ago. The subject line says fence permit approved, and the body says your application has been reviewed and approved. Proceed with installation per submitted plans. There is no mention of a survey. There is no mention of conditional approval. Heather looks at the email, looks at me and says, "That was sent in error. The real approval requires a survey, and since you do not have one, you are in violation." Mike says, "I am not stopping work without a written stop work order signed by the board president or an attorney." Heather says, "I am the special assessment coordinator, and I have authority to halt non-compliant construction." Mike says, "Show me the documentation." Heather does not have documentation. She takes 3 photos of the crew working. She takes 2 photos of the fence line, and then she says, "You will regret this," and walks away. I did not argue, because I already had something in my pocket she did not know about. That morning, before Mike arrived, I installed 2 new cameras. One points at the driveway and front door. One points at the side yard where the fence line is. They are wireless, they upload to cloud storage, and they have motion alerts. I installed them because Mike told me to, and because I was starting to realize Heather was going to escalate no matter what I did. I also started keeping a small notepad in my pocket. The pages are wet because I left it outside during a light drizzle yesterday, but I am writing down every interaction, every notice, every email, every threat. If this goes legal, I want a timeline. The crew works until 3 p.m. and gets the old fence completely torn out. The posts are pulled, the rails are stacked in my driveway, and the whole side yard is open dirt and marked property line. Mike strings a line between 2 stakes to mark where the new posts will go, and he sprays orange marks in the dirt every 8 feet. He takes photos of everything and sends them to me. He says if the HOA tries to say you moved the line or encroached, you have proof this is where it was. That night I get an email from Heather. The subject line says, "Final notice compliance deadline." The email says I have 24 hours to provide a licensed boundary survey or the HOA will file a lien packet with the county and assess emergency removal fees. She does not say what the fees are. She does not define emergency removal. She just says 24 hours. I forward the email to Mike. He replies in 5 minutes and says, This is illegal. HOAs cannot file liens without a hearing and a vote, and emergency removal is not a real thing unless there is imminent danger. He says I should contact an attorney. I do not have attorney money. I have survey money, barely, but I do not have attorney money, so I do the next best thing. I call the City Code Enforcement Office and ask if an HOA can require a survey for a fence replacement when the fence is going in the same location as the old one. The guy I talked to is named Russell, and he is a code enforcement officer who has been dealing with HOA complaints for 15 years. He listens to my story, he asks for my address and the HOA name, and then he laughs. He says, Hidden Creek again. He says they get calls about Hidden Creek twice a month, and most of the complaints are bogus. He says if my fence is under 6 feet, matches the style code and is set back from the property line, the city does not care and the HOA has no authority to stop me. He says the only time they care is if the fence blocks a public easement or a drainage path, and he can check the city maps to see if there is anything like that on my lot. Russell puts me on hold for 3 minutes, and when he comes back, he says there is no public easement on my property and no recorded drainage path. He says my lot is clean and the HOA is making things up. He says if I want, he can send me a letter on city letterhead confirming that the fence location is compliant with city code and I can use that to shut down the HOA. I say yes, please, and he says he will email it to me by end of business tomorrow. I hang up and feel like I can breathe again. I have an ally. I have documentation. I have proof that the HOA is lying. But I still do not know what Heather is planning next, and I know she is planning something. The next morning, Mike and his crew show up at 7:55. Heather is already there. She is standing in my driveway with her arms crossed, and she has 2 other people with me. One is a man in his 60s wearing a Hidden Creek Association polo and holding a clipboard. The other is a security guard in a black uniform, hovering near the clubhouse entrance at the end of the street. Heather says, "This is Bill. He is the HOA Property Compliance Manager, and he is here to witness the violation." Bill does not say anything. He just stands there holding the clipboard and looking uncomfortable. Heather points at Mike and says, "You are working during quiet hours." Mike looks at his watch and says, "It is 7:56 a.m. Quiet hours end at 7. Heather says, "Your truck was parked here at 6:45. That is a violation." Mike says, "I was not working. I was sitting in my truck drinking coffee." Heather says, "Your presence constitutes construction activity." Mike says, "Show me the rule." Heather does not show him the rule. She takes another photo. I step outside and say, "Heather, I have a letter from the city confirming the fence location is compliant." She says, "City code is irrelevant. HOA covenants supersede city code." I say, "No, they do not." She smiles and says, "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." Then she hands Bill a piece of paper and says, "Note the time, note the continued defiance, and note that we will proceed with lien filing this afternoon." Bill looks at the paper, looks at me, looks at Heather, and then quietly says, "I think we should table this until the board meeting next week." Heather snaps at him and says, "We do not have time for a meeting. This is an emergency removal situation." Bill says, "There is no emergency. The fence is being replaced in the same location." Heather says, "That is not your call." Bill says, "Actually it is. I am the property compliance manager, and I decide what gets escalated." Heather stares at him for 5 full seconds, and then she says, "Fine, we will discuss this later," and she walks away. Bill stays behind. He apologizes to me and says Heather has been pushing for aggressive enforcement on every little thing for the past 6 months, and the board is getting complaints from homeowners who feel targeted. He says my fence is fine, the permit was approved, and he is going to email me a confirmation by end of day. He says if Heather sends me any more threats, forward them to him, and he will handle it. Mike waits until Bill is gone, and then he says, "That was weird." I agree. I ask him if he has ever seen an HOA back down that fast. He says no, and he thinks something else is going on. He is right. That afternoon I get an email from Bill. The subject line says fence permit reconfirmed. The email says my project is approved per the original permit, no survey is required, and I am clear to proceed. He attaches a PDF of the approval with his signature and the date. I forward it to Mike, I print 2 copies, and I tape one to my front door, just in case Heather shows up again. She does not show up that day. She does not show up the next day either. The crew works for 3 full days without interruption, and by Friday afternoon, the new fence is halfway done. The posts are in, the rails are up, and the pickets are going on fast. It looks good. It is level, it is straight, and it is 2.5 feet inside my property line, exactly where it is supposed to be. Dan comes out again and says it looks great, and he thanks me for upgrading the neighborhood. I feel like maybe, finally, this nightmare is over. I am wrong. On Saturday morning, I wake up to a noise outside. It is 8:15 a.m., and someone is yelling in my side yard. I look out the window and see Heather standing next to the string line Mike left in place to mark the post locations. She is pulling on one of the survey stakes, trying to yank it out of the ground. My camera catches the whole thing. Her hand is wrapped around the stake, she is pulling hard, and the string snaps. The stake comes loose, and she stumbles backward, and then she sees the camera and freezes. I run outside. Heather drops the stake and says, "I was checking the alignment." I say, "You were pulling out my survey marker." She says, "This is not your property, this is HOA common area." I say, "No, it is not, this is 2.5 feet inside my lot line." She says, "Prove it." I say, "I have a city letter and a plat map." She says, "Those are not valid without a licensed survey." I say, "Bill already approved the project." She says, "Bill does not have final authority, I do." That is when I realize she is not going to stop. She is not interested in rules or facts or documentation. She wants me to fail. She wants me to spend money I do not have, miss work I cannot afford to miss, and eventually give up and move. And the reason is simple: I am not part of her group. I do not go to HOA social events. I do not donate to the neighborhood holiday fund. I do not kiss her ring. So she is going to make my life hell until I leave. But I am not leaving. And I am not giving up. I pull out my phone and say, "I have video of you pulling out that stake." Heather says, "So what?" I say, "That is destruction of property and tampering with a legal boundary marker." She laughs and says, "You are going to call the police over a stick." I say, "Yes." She says, "Go ahead, they will not do anything." Then she walks away. I call the police. I tell them someone is tampering with my fence construction and destroying survey markers. The dispatcher asks if there is an active threat. I say no. She says an officer will come by when one is available, but it might be a few hours because it is not an emergency. I say that is fine, and I send her the video file from my camera. 3 hours later, an officer shows up. His name is Garcia, and he is polite and professional. I show him the video. I show him the email thread with Heather. I show him the notices she taped to my door. I show him the city letter from Russell confirming my fence is compliant. He takes notes, he takes photos of the broken stake and the snapped string line, and then he says, "This is a civil issue, not a criminal one. But if she comes back and does it again, call us and we will document it as harassment." I thank him, and he leaves. I text Mike and tell him what happened. He says, "I am coming over." He shows up 20 minutes later with a new stake, a new string line, and a bottle of wood glue. He resets the stake, pulls the string tight, and then says, "I am installing a camera here too, because if she does this again, we need better angles." He mounts a small trail camera on a fence post pointed directly at the string line. He says it records motion and has night vision. I pay him $50 for the camera and thank him. Mike finishes the fence on Monday. It is perfect. 5.5 feet tall, cedar pickets, clean horizontal rails, stained a medium brown, and set back exactly 2.5 feet from the property line. Dan comes over and says it is the best-looking fence on the block. I agree. I pay Mike the final invoice. I take about 30 photos from every angle, and I email them to Bill with a note saying project complete per approved permit. Bill replies in 10 minutes and says, "Looks great, file closed." I print the email and add it to my folder. I feel like I can finally relax. Then I get a text from Dan. He says, "Check the neighborhood group chat." I do not use the neighborhood group chat because it is mostly people complaining about trash pickup and asking who has the best lawn service. But I log in and scroll down, and my stomach drops. Heather has posted a long message. The subject line says, "Urgent violation alert, property defacement and boundary encroachment." The message says I installed a fence without proper approval. The fence encroaches on HOA common area. I refuse to provide required documentation, and the HOA is pursuing emergency legal action to force removal. She includes 3 photos. One shows my fence from the street. One shows the side yard. One shows the broken survey stake on the ground, and the caption says homeowner destroyed HOA boundary markers to hide encroachment. The post has 47 comments in 2 hours. Most of them are people saying they always knew I was trouble, or asking why the HOA lets people get away with stuff like this, or saying the board needs to crack down harder. A few people ask for proof. One person says, "I thought his fence was approved." Heather replies to that comment and says the approval was conditional and he failed to meet the conditions. I am furious. I am also trapped, because if I reply in the group chat, I look defensive and guilty. If I do not reply, everyone assumes Heather is telling the truth. I do not know what to do. Then I remember what Mike said. Document everything. Use the evidence. Do not argue, just show the facts. I screenshot the group chat post. I download all the emails from Bill, Heather, and the city. I download the video of Heather pulling the stake. I download the police report number Garcia gave me. I download the photos Mike took of the old fence and the new fence. I download the original permit approval email. I put it all in a folder on my desktop and label it HOA fence evidence. Then I send an email to the HOA board president. His name is Greg, and I have never met him, but his email is on the HOA website. I attach the entire evidence folder and write a short message. I say, Heather Jones has been harassing me for 6 weeks over a legally approved fence project. She has lied in official correspondence, and on the neighborhood group chat, she destroyed my property on camera. And I am requesting an immediate board review. I include my phone number and say I am available to meet at any time. Greg replies in 30 minutes. He says, I was not aware of this situation. I will review the materials and get back to you within 48 hours. I feel a tiny bit hopeful. 2 days later, Greg calls me. He sounds tired. He says he reviewed everything, he watched the video, he talked to Bill, and he agrees Heather overstepped. He says the board is going to have a special meeting next week to discuss compliance enforcement policies, and he wants me to attend. He says I do not have to speak if I do not want to, but my presence will make it clear this is a real issue and not just a personality conflict. I say I will be there. The meeting is on a Thursday night at 7 p.m. in the HOA clubhouse. I arrive at 6:55. The room is small, with a folding table at the front and about 20 chairs set up in rows. There are already 10 people there. I recognize a few faces from the neighborhood. Heather is sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and her plastic badge clipped to her cardigan. She does not look at me. Greg is at the table with 2 other board members. He starts the meeting by saying they are here to review enforcement procedures and address concerns about inconsistent application of HOA rules. He does not say my name. He does not say Heather's name. He just says there have been complaints, and the board takes them seriously. Heather raises her hand and says, I would like to address the complaints. Greg says, you will have an opportunity. Heather says, I want to address them now. Greg says, we are going to follow the agenda. Heather stands up and says, this is a witch hunt. I have done nothing wrong. I am enforcing the covenants exactly as written. And if people do not like it, they should not have signed the covenants. Greg says, please sit down. Heather says no. She points at me and says, he installed a fence without a survey, he destroyed HOA boundary markers, he lied to the board, and he is trying to intimidate me because he does not want to follow the rules. You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants. I do not say anything. I just sit there and let her talk, because I know what is coming next. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA horror stories where the truth actually comes out. Greg lets Heather finish, and then he says, thank you for your input. He opens a folder and pulls out a printed copy of the email chain I sent him. He says, I have reviewed all the documentation provided by the homeowner, and I have also reviewed the original permit approval. He holds up the email from Bill that says fence permit reconfirmed. He says, according to this, the project was approved and no survey was required. Heather, can you explain why you continued to demand a survey after this approval was issued? Heather says, the approval was issued in error. Greg says, by whom? Heather says, by Bill. Greg says, Bill is the property compliance manager. He has authority to issue approvals. Heather says, I am the special assessment coordinator. I have authority to override approvals if there is a compliance risk. Greg says, show me where that authority is defined in the bylaws. Heather does not answer. She just stares at Greg. Greg says, I will save you the time. It is not in the bylaws. You do not have authority to override compliance approvals. You have authority to assess fees for violations after they are confirmed by the board. That is it. Heather says, this is ridiculous. Greg says, I am not finished. He pulls out another piece of paper and says, I also have a police report documenting that you were observed on video removing a survey stake from the homeowner's property. He turns the paper around so everyone can see it. He says, this is destruction of property and it is a violation of Alaska state law. Heather, you are suspended from all HOA enforcement duties effective immediately, and the board will vote next month on whether to remove you from your coordinator role permanently. The room is dead silent. Heather's face goes red. She says, you cannot do this. Greg says, yes, I can. The bylaws give the board president authority to suspend officers pending investigation. Heather says, this is personal. You are targeting me because you do not like me. Greg says, this is not personal. This is about liability. If the homeowner decides to sue the HOA for harassment, we are exposed, and it is because of your actions. Heather stands up, grabs her stack of pre-filled forms, and says, fine, you deal with it, I am done. She walks out. The door slams behind her. No one says anything for about 10 seconds. Then one of the other board members, a woman named Sandra, says, I think we need to review all of Heather's enforcement actions from the past year, because I have a feeling this is not the only time she went rogue. Greg agrees. The meeting continues for another 30 minutes. They talk about updating the enforcement policy, requiring board approval for any lien filings, and creating a formal appeals process for homeowners who think they were treated unfairly. I do not say much. I just sit there and let them talk. At the end, Greg thanks me for bringing the issue to the board's attention, and he says if I have any other problems, email him directly. I leave the meeting feeling like I won, but I know Heather is not done. People like her do not just walk away. They regroup, they find a new angle, and they come back harder. I am right. 2 weeks later, I get a letter in the mail. It is from a law firm in Anchorage. The letterhead says Johnson & Associates, attorneys at law. The letter says Heather Jones has retained their services to pursue a civil claim for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It says I made false statements to the HOA board and the police. I destroyed her reputation in the community, and I created a hostile environment that forced her to resign from her volunteer position. It demands a written apology and $5,000 in damages, or they will file a lawsuit. I read the letter 3 times. Then I call Mike and read it to him. He says, this is a slap suit. It is designed to scare you into shutting up. He says I should not respond without talking to a lawyer. I do not have a lawyer. I do not have $5,000. I barely have $500 after paying for the fence. I call Russell at the City Code Enforcement Office and ask if he knows any attorneys who handle HOA disputes. He gives me 2 names. I call both. The first one charges $300 an hour and wants a $5,000 retainer. The second one charges $250 an hour and says she can do a consult for free if I bring all my documentation. Her name is Patricia, and I meet her the next day. I bring the folder with all the emails, the videos, the police report, the permit approvals, and the demand letter. She spends 20 minutes reviewing everything, and then she looks up and says, this is the weakest defamation claim I have seen in 5 years. She says truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and everything I said to the board and the police was true and supported by evidence. She says Heather has no case, and if she actually files a lawsuit, it will get dismissed and she will probably have to pay my legal fees. Patricia says the smart move is to respond to the demand letter with a short statement saying, "I stand by everything I said, I have documentation to support it, and I will not be paying any damages." She says she can draft the response for $200. I say yes. The response goes out 3 days later. It is 1 page. It says I received the demand letter, I dispute all claims, I have video evidence and written documentation supporting my statements, and I will not engage in further settlement discussions. It is signed by Patricia and includes her bar number. I do not hear back from Johnson and Associates. I do not hear back from Heather. I assume that is the end of it. Then, 4 weeks later, I get a call from Greg. He says, "I need to give you a heads up. Heather filed a complaint with the HOA insurance carrier, claiming the board retaliated against her and created a hostile work environment. The carrier is sending an investigator to interview board members and review records. Greg says he is not worried because the evidence is clear, but he wanted me to know in case the investigator contacts me." The investigator calls me 2 days later. Her name is Anne, and she works for the insurance company that covers the HOA's liability policy. She asks me to describe what happened. I walk her through the whole timeline. She takes notes. She asks for copies of the emails, the videos, and the police report. I send everything. She thanks me and says she will be in touch if she has follow-up questions. 3 weeks go by. I do not hear anything. Then I get a voicemail from Greg. He sounds happy. He says, "Call me back when you get a chance, I have good news." I call him that night. He says the insurance investigator finished her review and issued a report. The report says Heather's claims are not supported by the evidence, the board acted appropriately, and the suspension was justified. But the report also says the HOA has a systemic problem with inconsistent enforcement and lack of oversight, and if the board does not implement reforms within 60 days, the carrier will non-renew the policy at the end of the year. Greg says the board is taking it seriously. They voted to adopt a new enforcement policy that requires all violation notices to be reviewed by 2 board members before they are issued, all lien filings to be approved by a majority vote, and all enforcement actions to be logged in a public database so homeowners can see what is being enforced and why. He says they also voted to terminate the HOA's relationship with the vendor Heather used to take the staged photos, because the investigator found evidence that Heather paid the vendor to come to my property without my knowledge and take pictures that made it look like I was violating setback rules. I asked Greg what vendor. He says it was a property inspection company that the HOA uses for annual common area maintenance checks. He says Heather told the vendor I requested an inspection, but I never requested anything. The vendor showed up, took photos of my fence from angles that made it look like it was on the property line instead of 2.5 feet back, and submitted an invoice to the HOA for an emergency compliance inspection. Greg says the board paid the invoice without questioning it, but the investigator found text messages between Heather and the vendor where Heather explicitly asked them to make the fence look non-compliant. The investigator included the texts in her report, and the board voted to cancel the vendor contract and demand a refund. I am stunned. I ask Greg if he is saying Heather fabricated evidence. He says yes. I ask if that is illegal. He says probably, but the board is not going to pursue criminal charges because the insurance company told them it would open the HOA up to liability. Instead, they are just cutting ties with Heather and the vendor and moving on. I thank Greg for telling me. I hang up and sit there for a while trying to process everything. Heather tried to destroy me over a fence. She lied. She fabricated evidence, she filed bogus complaints, she tried to sue me, and she almost got away with it. The only reason she did not is because I documented everything. I had cameras, and I had allies who were willing to stand up and say this is wrong. But I am still not done. Because Heather's post is still up in the neighborhood group chat, and everyone still thinks I am the bad guy. I log into the group chat and scroll down to Heather's post. It has 83 comments now. I read through them. Half the comments are people defending Heather and saying the board should not have suspended her. The other half are people saying they always thought the HOA was too aggressive, and this proves it. No one has the full story. No one knows about the fabricated photos or the vendor texts or the insurance investigation. I do not want to get into a fight in the group chat. But I also do not want people to keep thinking I am a liar. So I post a short message. I say, I want to clarify what happened with my fence project. I include a link to a Google Drive folder with all the documentation, the original permit approval, the city letter, the police report, the video of Heather pulling the stake, the insurance investigator's report summary that Greg sent me, and the board's new enforcement policy. I do not editorialize. I just say, here are the facts, draw your own conclusions. The post gets 27 comments in the first hour. Most of them are people apologizing to me and saying they did not know the full story. A few people say they had similar problems with Heather and they are glad someone finally stood up. One person says, I knew something was off. Heather always had it out for people she did not like. Then, 6 hours later, Heather's original post disappears. In its place is a message from the group chat admin. The admin is a guy named Tom who lives 3 streets over. The message says, the previous post contained false information and has been removed. A correction has been posted in the announcement section. I click over to the announcement section and see a new post from Greg. It says the board reviewed recent enforcement actions and found that several violation notices were issued without proper approval. It says the board is implementing new policies to prevent this from happening again, and any homeowners who believe they were unfairly targeted should contact the board for a review. That is when I know it is over. Heather's group post gets removed and replaced with a correction. The HOA cancels the vendor relationship tied to the abuse. And I have a third-party compliance report that clears me completely. The funny part is, the video of Heather pulling the stake proves the opposite of her claim. She said I destroyed the boundary marker. The video shows her doing it. That one piece of evidence flipped everything. I do not see Heather around the neighborhood after that. I hear from Dan that she moved out about 2 months later. Someone else told me she bought a condo in a building with no HOA. I do not know if that is true, but I hope it is. I hope she learned something. My fence is still standing. It looks great. Every time I walk past it, I think about how close I came to losing, and how important it was to document everything and find people who were willing to help. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new enforcement policy actually works. People are not getting random notices for things that are not violations. The board is more transparent. And I am just a guy with a fence who wanted to follow the rules and was willing to fight when someone tried to make up new ones. A few months after everything settled, I ran into Bill at the grocery store. He recognized me and came over to apologize. He said he felt terrible about what happened and he should have stepped in sooner. I told him I appreciated him speaking up at the meeting, and that made a difference. He said Heather had been pushing the board to adopt stricter rules for over a year, and a lot of board members were afraid to push back because she was so aggressive. He said my situation was the breaking point, and it forced the board to actually look at what she was doing. Bill also told me something I did not know. He said the vendor Heather used to take the staged photos was owned by her brother-in-law. That is why she was so confident the photos would support her story. She thought no one would question them because they came from an official inspection company. But the insurance investigator figured it out when she cross-referenced the vendor's business registration and found the family connection. That detail was not in the public summary Greg shared, but Bill said it was in the full report, and it was the reason the board moved so fast to cut ties. I asked Bill if the HOA ever got the refund from the vendor. He said no. The vendor claimed the inspection was legitimate and refused to return the money. The board decided not to sue because the legal fees would cost more than the refund. But they did add the vendor to a shared blacklist that other HOAs in the area use, so the guy lost a lot of future business. That felt like justice to me. Not perfect, but enough. The next big moment came 6 months later at the annual HOA meeting. Every homeowner is allowed to attend, and there is a section at the end where people can ask questions or raise concerns. I went because I wanted to see how the new board policies were working. The meeting was boring for the first hour. Budget reports, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance schedules. Then, during the open comment section, a woman I did not recognize stood up and said she wanted to thank the board for the new enforcement policy. She said she got a violation notice last year for having a trash can visible from the street, and she spent 3 months fighting it because the rule was not actually in the covenants. She said the new policy would have prevented that, and she was glad the board learned from past mistakes. 3 other people stood up and said similar things. One guy said he got fined for parking his work truck in his driveway overnight, even though the covenant only restricted commercial vehicles over a certain weight and his truck was under the limit. Another woman said she got a notice for having the wrong color mailbox, even though the approved color list was never published. All of them said they were happy the board was finally being transparent and consistent. Greg thanked them for the feedback and said the board was committed to fair enforcement going forward. Then he said something I did not expect. He said the board was considering a formal apology program for homeowners who were unfairly targeted under the old system, and they were working with the insurance carrier to see if any fines could be refunded. He said it was not guaranteed, but they were trying. I did not stand up or say anything. I did not need to. The system was changing, and that was enough for me. That winter, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. I opened it expecting another notice, but it was actually a check. The memo line said refund overpaid assessment fees. The amount was $250, the exact amount Heather charged me for the first bogus violation. There was a note from Greg attached. It said the board reviewed all enforcement actions from the previous year and identified several cases where fees were charged without proper justification. He said they were issuing refunds to everyone affected, and he apologized for the inconvenience. I deposited the check and used the money to buy a new grill. Every time I use it, I think about Heather and her plastic badge and her stack of pre-filled forms. I think about how she said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." And I think about how she was the one who ended up embarrassed, because her own actions and her own words were the evidence that brought her down. The fence is still standing. The neighborhood is quieter. The rules are clearer. And I am still here, living in the house I bought, following the covenants I signed, and knowing that when someone tries to break the rules to punish you, the best thing you can do is document everything and let their own actions speak for themselves. One more thing happened that I want to mention. About a year after the insurance investigation, I got a call from a reporter at the Anchorage Daily News. She said she was working on a story about HOA enforcement abuses in Alaska, and someone gave her my name as a source. I asked who. She said she could not say, but she heard I had documentation and video evidence that would help illustrate the problem. I was hesitant at first. I did not want to relive the whole mess, and I definitely did not want my name in the paper. But the reporter said she would keep me anonymous if I wanted, and she just needed the documents to fact-check the story. She said she already had interviews with 3 other homeowners in different HOAs who had similar experiences, and she was trying to show that this was a systemic issue, not just isolated incidents. I thought about it for a day, and then I sent her the evidence folder. I told her she could use anything she wanted, but I did not want to be quoted. She agreed. The story ran 2 months later. The headline was HOA enforcement abuses leave Alaska homeowners fighting bogus fines, fabricated violations. It was a long piece, about 3,000 words, and it covered multiple cases across Anchorage and the surrounding area. My situation was in there, but it was anonymized. The reporter described it as a case where an HOA coordinator used staged photos and false claims to target a homeowner over a fence, and the homeowner only won because he had video evidence and an insurance investigation forced reforms. The story got a lot of attention. It was shared on local news sites and social media. The state legislature even held a hearing about HOA oversight and whether Alaska needed stronger laws to protect homeowners. Nothing concrete came out of the hearing, but at least people were talking about it. A few neighbors reached out after the story ran and asked if I was the anonymous homeowner. I did not confirm or deny. I just said I was glad people were paying attention to the issue. The story also got picked up by a national HOA reform advocacy group. They asked if they could use my documentation as a case study in their training materials for homeowners dealing with abusive boards. I said yes. They anonymized everything and used it to teach people how to document violations, gather evidence, and escalate complaints to insurance carriers and state agencies. I never got paid for it, but I did not care. If my experience helped someone else avoid the same nightmare, that was worth it. The last big moment came 2 years after the fence was finished. The HOA held elections for new board members. Greg decided not to run again because he was moving out of state for work. 3 people ran for his seat, including Bill. Bill won by a landslide. His platform was simple: enforce the rules fairly, be transparent, and do not waste homeowner money on petty conflicts. He kept his promise. Under Bill's leadership, the HOA updated the covenants to remove vague or unenforceable rules. They published a clear list of approved fence styles, paint colors, and landscaping guidelines. They created an online portal where homeowners could submit permit requests and track the approval process. And they required all violation notices to include a reference to the specific covenant section being enforced, along with a photo and a clear explanation of how to fix the issue. It sounds like basic common sense, but it was revolutionary for Hidden Creek. People stopped complaining about arbitrary enforcement. Violation notices dropped by about 70%. And the HOA stopped being the enemy. It became what it was supposed to be: a boring administrative entity that handled common area maintenance and stayed out of people's lives. I never ran for the board. I did not want the job. But I did start going to the annual meetings, and I made sure to vote in every election. I figured if I was going to live in an HOA, the least I could do was pay attention and hold the board accountable. Dan moved away about 3 years after the fence incident. He got a job in Seattle and sold his house. The new neighbors are nice. They have 2 kids and a dog, and they complimented my fence the first week they moved in. I told them the story, the short version, and they laughed and said they were glad the HOA was not like that anymore. The fence itself has held up great. The cedar aged to a nice silver gray, and the posts are still solid. I restain it every couple of years, and I check the string line markers every spring just to make sure no one is messing with them. The cameras are still up. I never took them down. They are a reminder that documentation is power, and if you are going to stand up to someone who is willing to lie, you need proof. I still see the cheap plastic badge in my mind sometimes. Heather wore it like a crown, like it gave her authority she did not actually have. I think about how she said, "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants," and how those words came back to haunt her when the board applied the covenants fairly and suspended her. I think about how she said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed," and how the insurance investigator made everything public and she was the one who ended up embarrassed. The best part of all of it is that I did not have to break any rules or do anything shady to win. I just followed the process, gathered evidence, and let the system work. It took longer than I wanted. It cost more than I wanted. It was stressful and exhausting, and there were days I wanted to give up. But I did not, and that made all the difference. A few years ago, I got a message on social media from someone I did not know. The profile picture was blank, and the account had no posts. The message said, "I heard you had problems with the Hidden Creek HOA a while back. I am dealing with something similar and I do not know what to do. Can you give me any advice?" I did not know if it was real or spam, but I replied. I said, "Document everything, keep a timeline, install cameras, and do not argue with them in person. Let the evidence speak for itself. If they escalate, get an attorney consult even if you think you cannot afford it. Because one letter from a lawyer can change the whole dynamic. And do not give up, because people like that are counting on you to give up." The person replied and thanked me. They said they were going to follow my advice. I do not know what happened after that. I never heard from them again. But I hope it helped. I also started keeping a file on my computer labeled HOA Evidence Template. It has a folder structure with sections for emails, photos, videos, police reports, permit approvals, and meeting notes. I made it because I realized that if I ever have to deal with something like this again, I want to be ready from day one. And if someone else asks for advice, I can just send them the template and say, "Start documenting now, before things get worse." I have shared the template with about a dozen people over the years. Most of them found me through local Facebook groups or neighborhood forums. A few found me through the Anchorage Daily News article after they figured out I was the anonymous source. Every time someone reaches out, I send them the template and tell them the same thing. Do not let them intimidate you, and do not let them make you think you are wrong when you are right. One guy told me he used my template to fight a ridiculous fine for having a garden gnome in his front yard. The HOA said garden decorations were not allowed, but the covenant only restricted signs and statues over a certain height. He documented the whole thing, sent the evidence to the board, and got the fine reversed in 2 weeks. He thanked me and said he never would have known how to organize everything without the template. Another woman told me she used it to prove her HOA was selectively enforcing parking rules. She had photos of 6 different neighbors who parked in the same spot she got fined for, and none of them got notices. She presented the evidence at a hearing, and the board apologized and refunded her fine. She said it was the most satisfying moment of her life. Those stories make me feel like the whole nightmare was worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone who came after. There is one last thing I want to say. If you are reading this and you are dealing with an HOA that is targeting you, or a board member who is abusing their power, or a neighbor who is making your life hell, here is what I learned. First, you are not crazy. If you think something is unfair, it probably is. Trust your gut. Second, document everything. Emails, texts, photos, videos, voice memos, meeting notes, everything. You do not know what you are going to need until you need it, so save everything. Third, find allies. There are people in your community who see what is happening and who will stand up if you give them a reason. It might be a neighbor, a board member, a city employee, or an attorney. You do not have to fight alone. Fourth, do not argue with people who are not arguing in good faith. If someone is lying or making things up, you cannot reason with them. You just have to outlast them and let the evidence do the talking. Fifth, use the system. File complaints, request hearings, escalate to insurance carriers, contact state agencies, talk to reporters. The system is slow and frustrating, but it works if you push hard enough. And sixth, do not give up. People like Heather want you to give up. They want you to move, or pay the fine, or shut up. Because if you do that, they win. Do not let them win. I stayed. I fought. I won. And my fence is still standing. Sometimes I walk past that fence and I think about the mailbox cluster performance where Heather tried to recruit complaints like a campaign. She stood there with her clipboard and her badge, going door to door in the neighborhood, telling people I was violating setback rules and endangering property values. She told them I was refusing to cooperate, that I was aggressive and hostile, and that the board needed to take action before I set a bad precedent. A few people listened. Most people ignored her. But the fact that she tried showed me how desperate she was to control the narrative. The other set piece I will never forget is the property stake sabotage scene where Heather tried to pull the stake and my camera caught her hand doing it. That moment changed everything. Up until then, it was her word against mine. After that, I had proof. Proof that she was willing to destroy evidence. Proof that she was not just enforcing rules, she was trying to frame me. Proof that I was right to document everything. Because without those cameras, I would have lost. Those 2 moments, the mailbox campaign and the stake sabotage, were the turning points. They showed everyone what Heather was really doing, and they gave me the ammunition I needed to fight back. I think about the insurance carrier issuing a non-renewal warning, demanding reforms within days, and the board caving because the whole neighborhood could lose coverage. That was the moment I knew I had won. Not because I defeated Heather, but because the system finally recognized that what she was doing was wrong and had real consequences. The board could ignore me. They could ignore Greg. They could even ignore Bill. But they could not ignore the insurance company threatening to pull coverage. That was the leverage that forced change. And the funniest part, the part that still makes me smile, is that Karen's own clip proves the opposite of her claim. She said I destroyed the boundary marker. The video shows her doing it. She walked right into the frame, wrapped her hand around the stake, pulled it out of the ground, and looked directly at the camera when she realized she was caught. It is almost poetic. She spent weeks building a case against me, fabricating violations, staging photos, lying to the board. And in the end, the one piece of evidence that destroyed her was her own action, captured in 4 seconds of video. I printed a still frame from that video and I keep it in my desk drawer. Not because I am bitter or want revenge, but because it reminds me that the truth always comes out if you give it time and space. You just have to be patient and let people expose themselves. The neighborhood is different now. The rules are clearer. The board is more accountable. The enforcement is more consistent. People are not afraid to ask questions or push back when something does not make sense. And the culture has shifted from punitive to cooperative. It is not perfect, but it is better. I still live here. I still go to work every morning. I still manage the gym and open the doors at 5 a.m. and deal with all the chaos that comes with running a 24-hour facility. My license is clean. My record is clean. My fence is standing. And I sleep well at night knowing that I did the right thing, even when it was hard. One of the things I learned from all of this is that HOAs are only as good or bad as the people running them. Hidden Creek was not a bad HOA because the covenants were unfair or the rules were too strict. It was bad because one person, Heather, abused her position, and nobody stopped her until it became a liability. Once she was out and the board implemented real oversight, everything changed. The same rules, the same neighborhood, the same houses, but a completely different experience. That is why I tell people to get involved. Go to the meetings, vote in the elections, run for the board if you can. Because if you do not, someone like Heather will, and they will use that power to make your life hell. And once they are in, it is hard to get them out unless they do something so egregious that the insurance company steps in. I got lucky. I had cameras. I had allies. I had documentation. I had a code enforcement officer who was willing to help. I had an attorney who believed me. I had a board president who cared enough to investigate. Not everyone has those things. Not everyone wins. But if you are in a situation like mine, if you are being targeted by an HOA or a board member who is making things up, here is what I want you to know. You are not powerless. You have rights. You have options. You have the ability to fight back, and you do not have to do it alone. Find your allies. Build your evidence. Use the system. And do not give up. My fence is still standing. Heather is gone. The board reformed. The insurance carrier forced accountability. And I am still here, living my life, following the rules, and knowing that I stood up when it mattered. That is the whole story. That is what happened. And if you are dealing with something similar, I hope my experience helps you figure out your next move. I want to close with one final thought. A lot of people ask me if I regret buying a house in an HOA. The honest answer is no. I do not regret it. What I regret is not paying attention to the red flags before I moved in. I should have gone to a board meeting before I bought the house. I should have asked neighbors what the HOA was like. I should have read the covenants more carefully and looked at the enforcement history. I did not do any of that, and I paid the price. But I also learned that you can fight back, you can win, and you can change the system if you are willing to put in the work. And that is a lesson I would not have learned if I had bought a house without an HOA. So in a weird way, I am grateful for the experience. Not because it was fun or easy, but because it taught me how to stand up for myself and how to navigate broken systems. If you are thinking about buying a house in an HOA, do your homework, ask questions, read the fine print, go to a meeting, talk to the neighbors. And if something feels off, trust your gut and walk away. There are plenty of houses out there. You do not have to settle for one that comes with a board that is going to make your life miserable. And if you are already in an HOA and you are dealing with problems, do not wait for someone else to fix it. Start documenting now. Build your case. Find your allies. And when the time is right, make your move. Because people like Heather are counting on you to stay silent, and the only way to beat them is to speak up. My fence is still standing. My record is clean. My neighborhood is better. And I am still here, living proof that you can take on an abusive HOA and win. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.